Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. I'm Murray Darm. I'm the assistant editor of Ancient Warfare magazine. I am flying solo, so I will be answering your questions. And I've got a question from Greg from Patreon, one of our patrons. You too can become a patron of the podcast on Patreon. All you have to do is go to the website, patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast, and you can support us. There's 3 levels of support. You can also get a copy of the magazine, and of course there you can ask us your own question, which hopefully we can answer, or indeed you can just send us a question however you can find, carrier pigeon, whichever way comes best, and we will attempt to answer that question. This one from Greg is, how much military intelligence did the ancients use? And it's one of those questions you can answer by looking at how much did they use, and then the occasions, of course, when they didn't, which are probably more famous than the ones where they did. Greg continues, there are quite a few examples of the use of recon and scouting from ancient warfare, perhaps more where it didn't happen, indeed, and examples of espionage and intel versus xenos or xenoi relationships in the Greek world with foreigners. But how much do we see that we might recognize as military intelligence function, and how dependent was it on the personality of a commander? Right. So we should see a lot of military intelligence in the ancient world. And indeed, as Greg points out, we probably see less of it more often than we should, because we have famous examples of the lack of scouting, for instance, and the lack of knowing where the enemy was on various occasions, famously associated with Hannibal, the Battle of Lake Trasimene, for instance, where the Romans blunder into a perfectly set up ambush that scouts would have told you the Carthaginians are in the hills waiting to fall upon you as you march beside the lake. But other ones too, the Battle of Adrianople. I think that the Battle of Adrianople is another example where Valens was so intent on fighting the Goths that he didn't send out scouts. So he didn't know where the main body of the Goths was, and they were basically laying their own kind of trap for him. And lots of other examples of similar kinds of lack of intelligence. But I think it's also probably more present than we tend to focus on. We know that, for instance, the Persians are throughout Greece in the lead up to the Persian Wars. There are there are Persian ambassadors at multiple Greek cities and Greek communities making deals with those communities to come over to Persia, or at least not fight on the side of the Greeks. Famously, obviously, in the film, you have "This is Sparta" and the kicking of a Persian ambassador down a well. Very unlikely that happened. Desecrating an ambassador is a very dangerous thing to do. And of course, far more Greek cities went over to the Persian cause, or at least didn't join the Greek cause, than we normally get. Poor old Thebes gets blamed for being the Medizing city, but it was most of the Greek communities. The number of Greek communities who fought against the Persians was actually quite minimal. So in that regard, you've got a huge network of information going both directions. The number of Greeks who are living in Ionia, most of the Athenians who get exiled or ostracized from Athens end up in Ionia somewhere. So they're probably sending information back about what's going on. Famously, you've got the Battle of Salamis, where you've got communication between the Greek fleet. Themistocles famously sending across a man to tell Xerxes that the Greeks are planning on sailing around Salamis, and then that escape route is blocked, so it's a double bluff. So there's all sorts of communication occurring that we don't tend to focus on. There's lots and lots of information from deserters, perhaps most famously again a false deserter before the Battle of Kadesh, where the Hittites are captured, and they say that the Hittite army is miles away, but in fact it's just around the next bend of the river, kind of thing. So lots of examples of intelligence going wrong, and intelligence gathering going wrong. At the other end of antiquity, I've been doing some work on Attila the Hun. We concentrate with Attila on his invasion of the West in 451, where he fights the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. But prior to that, he's ravaging the Eastern Roman Empire into the diocese of Thrace and into Illyria and things there. And he clearly knows when to attack. So in 441, there's a Vandal invasion of Sicily. Gaiseric, the Vandal king, invades Sicily, ravages Sicily, and help is sent from the Byzantine Empire to the Eastern Roman Empire at that point in time to deal with it. So he sends his commanders and most of the army to Sicily. Of course, when they get to Sicily, Gaiseric, the Vandal's already left and gone back to Carthage. And the army, the Eastern Roman army, then plunders Sicily itself. But interestingly, Attila the Hun seems to know that that's when he should attack the Eastern Roman Empire, because the Roman armies are going to be absent. So there's clearly information gathering going on. We know that there are embassies. Obviously, the historian Priscus goes on an embassy to Attila. There's at least 3 others. Cassiodorus goes on another one. And they're taking information, but they're also giving information, perhaps unwittingly. We know that there are Hun ambassadors in the Roman Empire, and they're passing information back. So I think there's vast networks of intelligence gathering and giving going on, and we don't tend to focus on it. There have been some books on military intelligence, but they tend to focus on scouting and all of that sort of material. I don't think it's quite as exciting as behind enemy lines operatives that you would get in a modern military sense, or you can't talk about agents or activating elements and things like that. I doubt that that's quite the case, but there's probably people who knew people who made deals, knew what was coming, knew, even passing on a piece of information like there's a big fleet being gathered at Constantinople could be extrapolated to say, well, that means that they're shipping an army. There's no other reason for there to be a fleet. So all those sorts of things you get are evidence that there must be some kind of intelligence network, which is actually quite complex and quite widespread in operation. There's other little stories of, for instance, again, much later, you get Belisarius's invasion of Vandal North Africa. And we're quite lucky to have Procopius, because Procopius was with Belisarius on that campaign. So his information is quite detailed. And we get the story of a slave that Procopius finds in Syracuse, and Belisarius has landed in Sicily before going on to North Africa, and he's worried about the Vandal fleet. And he's told, oh, don't worry, that the Vandal fleet's gone off to Sardinia because Sardinia has revolted from Vandal control. Therefore, there's no fleet in Carthage. You're fine. So Belisarius goes off and invades and runs what is perhaps one of the most lightning conquests, because he basically conquers all of Vandal-held North Africa from the Straits of Gibraltar all the way to the coast of the borders of Egypt in less than 3 months. Ridiculous. And he's clearly got scouts ahead too. We know that when he's marching his army towards Carthage, that he's got a unit behind, he's got units out to the left and a unit out in front, moving with the army in the center. So he knows that there's a Vandal force shadowing him. But again, the Vandal force seems to have military intelligence of its own. Say they have an army coming out from Carthage, another army coming from the west, and then the main force from behind. So they are planning to trap and encircle Belisarius. Belisarius, meanwhile, has his troops out telling him what's going on. And the outcome is that Belisarius's troops are completely victorious and destroy the Vandals in one day. So There's intelligence on both sides. More often than not, of course, we concentrate on the one whose intelligence fails and leads to disaster. We know that Caesar has networks of spies. We've got lots of information on spies and codes, whether it be wrapped around a stick, tattooed on your head, and shave your head, tattoo the message, and then grow your hair back. Obviously, going to take a while. Or a wax tablet with the writing on the wood. So all of those sorts of information. Aeneas Tacticus back in the 4th century BC has also got lots of ways to give coded information, and we've got signaling systems and all sorts of things. So there's absolutely evidence of vast intelligence networks. It's just that more often than not, it's nigh on invisible, or we concentrate on it when it fails.